Good morning, everybody, and welcome back after what's been quite an extended break due to COVID. But I'm delighted to be resuming these talks we've been doing for the Friends of Reading Abbey in what is now actually the 900th anniversary year of the foundation of our Abbey. So this is our fourth talk, and I'm actually delighted to welcome our speaker, Matthew Williams. I say I welcome him, we're actually sitting in his museum, but I think for the purposes of this, he's our guest today. Matthew studied archaeology at Exeter University before completing a postgrad diploma at Museum Studies at Leicester University. He's an associate of the Museums Association and a Chartered Institute of Archaeologists. He joined the staff of Reading Museum in the year 2000, and then 9 years later he was appointed the museum manager. He's now responsible for the museum's collection of over 400,000 objects of art, archaeology, natural history and social history. Under his leadership, the museum has seen many successes, including being nominated for the Art Fund Prize for Museums and Galleries in 2009. He's currently overseeing the development of the Abbey Portal for Reading Borough Council, which includes the reopening of the Abbey ruins and the gateway in June 2018, after an award-winning £3.2 million conservation project. So absolutely the man we want to be talking to us this morning. And our subject we've chosen is the Abbey, and particularly its an impact on a small town. And so we're going to explore how that relationship evolved between the town, the mayor, the corporation, the Abbey and the monks. So just to start us off, Matthew, 1120, just before the Abbey was formed, we have a small market town, 500 odd people?
Yeah.
A small town focused around, I think, the Butts area. That's what we had. Perhaps you tell us a bit more about that, and then what happened next.
Yeah, we think, so that period sort of before 1121, when Henry I founds the Abbey, the centre of Reading was actually over where St Mary's Butts today, where Reading Market is today. And it's at a crossroads, so we've kind of got a church, the Minster Church of Reading, an important church in this part of the Thames Valley. And there's probably a cluster of houses and a small market. And we know that was the market because when the Abbey starts, they start calling that the old market, because then the town shifts towards the Abbey and we've got the new market, which is our current marketplace. And there's been speculation about, why it was chosen as, for the site of the Abbey. But we know it was a royal town, and actually the first reference to Reading is right back in 871. The Viking army invades Reading. And so we know, and it's referred to as a royal ville, which means it's the centre of a royal estate. So we know that by the time that Henry comes to think about founding his abbey, that he's looking for a good site. Reading is very handy, it always has been that sort of centre of communications. It's between London, the West Country, Bristol, and further west into Wales. And he also owned it, so he's sort of thinking, that east-west, we had the Bath Road, and then that became the rail, when we had the rails and the canals. And then we've got the M4. So Reading's always been that sort of communication. So I think Henry was the same. I think it was William of Malmesbury said it was calculated to be on the location where all the great and the good of England would see it.
Yes.
So I think, again, it's a bit of showmanship. I'm going to build this vast abbey, and we have to think that it was the size of bigger than Westminster Abbey. So this huge cathedral-sized building. So he owned it. He knew people would see it. It was on a good route, and he owned this town. But I think the Saxon site, you've already got houses there. But he owns the rest of the manor, and I think they probably looked around and saw this lovely flat gravel spur between the Thames and the Kennet, to the west, to the east of the Saxon town, the Royal Hill. Yeah. And probably thought, well, that's a good site for a big abbey, because the constricted little Saxon town probably didn't have space. So there has been some speculation about whether there was an earlier Saxon church on the Abbey site in the Forbury. But I think probably unlikely. All the evidence is pointing towards it being at St Mary's Butts. There's archaeological evidence, there's coin hoards from the 9th century there. And also I think the other bit of evidence we've got is that when Henry founds the Abbey in 1121, he actually takes some land away from Battle Abbey, which was the abbey that his father, William the Conqueror, founded down in Sussex to mark the Battle of Hastings.
Yes.
And they had lands at Reading called Battle, which is why we get in Battle in West Reading, Battle School, and old residents remember Battle Hospital. Yeah. And that's all in West Reading, nearer the Saxon Minster. And we know in Domesday Book that was actually owned by a Saxon. It was actually recorded as originally being owned by a nun. So that makes sense. It's owned by the nunnery, confiscated, given to the Abbey. So again, all this evidence suggests that we've got a Saxon town there, and the Abbey comes along, and it's all rebuilt, and the whole shift of focus shifts from the Saxon town to this new medieval centre around the Abbey. So that's kind of where we are. That's setting the scene.
Very good. Okay. And it's fascinating. Each of these talks, the location of Reading, each time. It's put this idea of this thoroughfare, and the whole of Southern England seemed almost that everything moves through Reading, and still today, fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have sort of 500 odd sort of innocent townsfolk minding their own business, getting on with life, and suddenly what descends upon them?
Yeah, I think the impact must be, again, it was, 500 doesn't sound big to us, but then that's quite a sizable settlement in the Saxon period, so we can't judge it by modern standards. That would just be a small village now, wouldn't it? But then that was quite a sizable urban centre, as it were. But even so, they were used to sort of, probably people coming and going, probably people coming, travellers, as we're saying. But suddenly, you can imagine, like, whenever you build a vast infrastructure, the disturbance. So I kind of compare it, if you feel like when we were rebuilding Reading Station, 10 years ago when it started, all that construction that was going on, all this disruption that you were having in the centre of Reading, the builders, the things being built, down Cow Lane, that area all being moved. And then imagine that on this small town, and you've got this army of masons and builders coming in that were probably as many or probably more than the population.
Yeah.
You're actually the minority suddenly.
Yeah.
And then you've also got the king and all these monks appearing, telling you what to do, because the king hands the lordship of Reading to the abbot becomes the lord of Reading.
Yeah.
So it moves from the council. And if you think the king's an absentee landlord, so again, if your landlord's not around, you probably can get away with more, but suddenly your lord of your town, he's living on site, so perhaps you can't get away with as much as well. So something a bit like, we've got all these people from outside, we've got all these outsiders that we probably don't relate to, we've got these monks that we don't even know, this abbot. So I think those people were thinking, what on earth's going on? But gradually, I think some people probably spotted opportunities, thinking, well, hang on, there's economic ways in this. Others will be against change, and I think it's no different today, isn't it? When we build things, some people are for it, and other people don't like the change. So I think a lot of that's going on. But again, I'm sure it brought problems. I'm sure that there was disorder and drunkenness and all the other things that happen when you get a bunch of single men descending on a site that might happen with, there's going to be issues.
It's the sheer numbers we're talking about, because obviously today, yes, craneage, there's machinery. The whole thing, I think we've got a couple of pictures to show you, the whole thing was done by hand, maybe a few horses or oxen. So you've got this army of people, and they're working in stone. Now, most of the local villagers or townsfolk bottomed or thatched buildings. It's not a material they're used to working with. So I'm guessing we're talking about skilled craftsmen coming in. There must be a whole hierarchy of master masons and so on all the way down.
Definitely. So like anything else, you've got your kind of, they didn't have things as architects, but the master masons were always essentially the architect, and very important and very skilled, as you say, skilled craftsmen. And what we think was that probably within the hierarchy, this is a royal foundation, so it's under royal patronage. So Henry I would have wanted only the best for his abbey. I think the clue we've had, some recent work was done at Windsor. So again, another reason why Henry probably chose Reading is because we're not far from Windsor. Old Windsor was the site of the Anglo-Saxon and early Norman palace, and that was then abandoned later when William the Conqueror builds Windsor Castle as a defensive location. But it's Henry I that establishes Windsor as the palace it is today. And Henry actually builds what they call the King's House in the upper ward, and in the lower ward we've got the King's Hall. And there's evidence from stonework that the same masons who were building that new King's palace at Windsor were then deployed to Reading. And so I think it's the same controlling hand, the same thought, and the same level of palatial building is going on at both. And we know that from the surviving stones here at the museum. We've got the Caen stone carvings, which again, the stones coming from Normandy. That's a major expense, which you'd only do on a project that was of the premier division in the terms of architecture at the time.
And again, we're exploring this idea. There's vast quantities of obviously stone, the limestone, only coming down from Tainton and the Cotswolds, which I think was the majority of it, and then some of the specialist stuff coming across from Caen. So again, you've got your on-site workers, but then there's a whole infrastructure of wharfage, of barges presumably bringing in the stone, getting it up to the abbey. And then also, what we can still see today is the core of all the buildings, these vast walls built of packed flint. Now, I'm guessing that comes from the locality, either mined very close by or brought from the children's nearby.
I think very close to. So the flint is, as you're saying, is like we're a chalk and clay area. So we're good for brick making, which comes later, and tiles, which we need at the abbey. But there's no natural build stone immediately around Reading. It is chalk and the flint.
Yeah.
So the flint was probably came very locally. I think there's where you get chalk outcrops coming near the surface, you get the flint coming up.
Yeah.
And again, we've got later chalk and flint mines in Reading, like Field Road.
Yes, of course. Yes. Yeah,
so whether we were getting some mining locally, but probably in the immediate vicinity, up in Caversham, there's quite a lot of chalk mines that probably had flint layers in them as well.
Yeah.
And we get some chalk mines out of Palm Park. So I think that's relatively local. We're probably talking in the immediate 10-mile radius for that. But as you say, even the lesser limestone is coming from Oxfordshire, and that's coming down the Thames. And that's the stone that was later used in things like the Oxford Colleges or Blenheim Palace.
Yes,
so it's that lovely honey-coloured Cotswold stone. But again, major infrastructure, all coming by barges. And again, all had to be unloaded. And we know from the evidence we've got that there was a massive wharf, which is roughly where the Abbey Gardens office blocks are today, behind the Abbey at King's Road, Abbey Square. So again, vast blocks that are bringing out, vast wharves that are bringing out these blocks of stone. And again, it would have been, we're talking about a 40-year period, so must have been constant deliveries of material coming down the rivers.
So they start building in 1121. Again, it's a massive project. We painted a picture of this vast army of workmen and barges arriving, carts of flint and so on coming on site. This is a project, again, using the technology of the time. It's not sort of a project taking a year or so. This is decades of building. But actually, poor Henry then dies 1135, so within, 14 years or so of starting construction, it's needed, because it's his mausoleum.
Yeah, again, yes, and that's what we think he definitely built. He had the idea that this was going to be where his family was going to marry. It's going to be the mausoleums of the late Norman kings. The problem with Henry is that he leaves a very uncertain frame, because he leaves his only legitimate son the year before he founds him. He dies, drowns in the white ship in the Channel, and he leaves his daughter Matilda as his heir. And of course, unfortunately, equality was not what it was today in the medieval period. It was very insecure having a woman as the heir to a throne, and then it's her cousin Stephen that comes in and challenges her for that. So Henry's death just leads to what they call the anarchy, and so yes, it's very insecure.
Sorry. And that's what I find interesting, because we know that the building went on for about 40 years. The anarchy, obviously, major devastation in the area. It happened in Wallingford, we knew it happened in Windsor. And as far as I can tell, they barely carried on building Reading Abbey in the middle of all this chaos. That seems to be the theme of it.
Yes, it's amazing really that we're caught, Reading as ever, because that line of communication is caught between the warring sides. And the only evidence we do know is the famous sort of story of Reading Castle. We know that Stephen built a siege work at Reading, and the abbot complained, and it was within the abbey grounds. And there's been various theories about where is this temporary castle. But when we're talking a castle, we're talking something that was thrown up. It was a bit of earth, we have moats and some wooden, more like a siege work really. So it's not like we're not thinking Windsor Castle here. And it seems to be that because Wallingford and Windsor were the main castles, that Reading kind of probably got left alone. And it's still, it's a monastic site. These are still Christian, Christian kings and queens and royalty. They're invested in this. Henry is their relative, and it's his burial place.
Yes.
So I'm sure there is some respect, despite the fact there's war going on here. That it's still, perhaps Reading is not the strategic place of this.
That's the best explanation I've heard, actually. Which is, of course, that they're still the same family. So even if there's something else, this is the uncle or relation.
Or your
still his mausoleum,
or your son, or your father.
Yes.
So you think, and they would have been, the burial had only just happened, as you say. We know that he was buried in front of the high altar, so they must have been somewhere near finishing the East End to bury Henry there. It's probably then perhaps the nave and the West End were the bit still being constructed, and perhaps some of the lesser buildings.
Yeah.
So again, there was enough to bury Henry in front of that altar. I suppose, because we'd had, almost 15 years of construction by then, so you probably think the East End, but everything still else is happening. So perhaps that's the other thing, it was a bit of a building site still. Yeah. So again, perhaps it wasn't great strategically.
And just to go back, I don't want to overplay the whole thing about the builders and the masons, but do we have any sense of whether they were Anglo-Saxons, whether Norman specialists came across? And then do we know if they were sort of French Normans, did they stay in the town, or did they just move off on to the next project?
I don't think we really know. We don't have the records to show that. And again, a lot of the styles the stonework are sort of saying, this style is very stylistically similar, and it's Henry's the patron, so it's probably the same group. And it may have been that he's employed because the stone comes from Normandy, so he may have got Norman Masons. Essentially they are Normans.
Norman,
so yeah. But then I'm sure he would the best if there was an English Mason who was, or a Saxon origin Mason who was good. He'd probably want them anyway, regardless of their heritage. I suspect he probably got a mixture. I'm sure the Normans brought that over because they were more built in stone than the Saxons were. So perhaps there's an influence there. But I would have thought probably by this period you're probably starting to get locals trained up and apprenticeships, who are apprentices who are being trained on site such a long period, and then the labourers are probably just local people as well as people who are coming in to find work. So I suspect it changed over the period, really.
And we can't flog the point about all the skilled masonry. A lot of it was pretty humpy, lumpy sort of lifting and shifting. Lots of pack flint, smashing to size. You need a lot of unskilled labour. In addition, almost like again the navvies building the railways. A lot of people with shovels and picks, as opposed to the highly skilled ones.
Yes, the people digging the holes and digging the foundation. And then of course there would have been a lot of woodwork. So again, the Saxons pretty, good skilled at carpentry. So again, there might have been perhaps more Saxon origin people involved in the carpentry because that's more of a Saxon skill. So I think a mixture of both, really.
Okay, so we're building our abbey. Clearly a large growth of the town's sort of population. No doubt many of them stayed for generations after. And then so the thing is being built, or is being built, and then we have about a 400-year association between town and abbey. And there are a number of things, sort of themes to pick up. Perhaps I think the first one you wanted to talk about was really sort of the role of religion and the abbot and the power he had over the town. So perhaps you talk us through that aspect of it.
Well, so we hinted at when we were starting to talk that originally the king was the overlord, and suddenly the abbot becomes the Lord of Reading, and he's here in situ. He's here controlling the town. And I think what happens very quickly is that they're not content with the small Saxon town. It's also, you're building this vast abbey, this cathedral-sized infrastructure that needs income to look after it. So one of the ways they can do that is because Reading's a great location, is to develop the town so that actually economically it's thriving, because that will bring rents and tolls for markets and fairs to Reading. So very quickly, by the late 1100s, the abbey is actually town planning. It's changing the look of the town. And I think what's amazing, really, if you think about this is so distant past, this is still the town that is our town centre. So, when we were in Broad Street or the Marketplace or Aubrey Road, we were essentially on infrastructure that was laid out in the 1100s, late 1100s. So I think that, that's kind of amazing, that legacy. So we know this evidence is that for Broad Street, Friar Street, Marketplace, London Street is effectively a bypass. It's a route that bypasses the London Road over what is the High Bridge, which is the stone bridge down near the Oracle, still there today, 18th century bridge, up Duke Street into the new Marketplace, which funnels everyone to the gates of the Abbey. And all of that is controlling trade, where one can control that trade, get the money for it, control the town. And again, they have all the big fairs. When you have these big fairs, there's 3 big medieval fairs that are held in the Forbury. Again, all the people from miles around would have come to those and traded. So it's a real centre of economic life. And then, of course, we've got the pilgrimage, because, that's the other angle.
Just pause that moment. So we've got a picture we can show you, which is actually Speed's map of 1611. Obviously not much change between 1100s and 1600s. And we can see the site of the Abbey in the sort of top right-hand corner. You can see what was St Mary's Butts, the original Saxon town. And then you can see east-west, the new Friar Street, the new Broad Street, the new, what we call the Butter Market. As you say, completely changing this orientation and the sort of the focus of the town around the Abbey. And you're leading on to sort of like relics. When did the idea of relics become so important? Was it how early?
I think that very early on, probably within the church, and probably going back into the Saxon period, there would have been relics, but they become more and more important. I think the importance is that when Henry founds the Abbey, he gives relics immediately and says to his family, I think, he's looking at, I need this building, so we've talked about all these trades and the stoning to build it and the materials. He's then thinking, I need to give them the town, because that's income and importance and status. But then Henry and his family give lands all over Britain. So again, it's not just local lands, like there were vast lands like in Herefordshire, Leinster, which was another priory. There were lands even in Scotland at this point. So then the other thing Henry does, they make sure there are relics, and those relics are varied. But the key relic that actually probably comes through his daughter Matilda, we talked about in the Anarchy earlier, is the hand of St James the Apostle. So having a hand of the Apostle, one of the original followers of Christ, that's the Premier Division.
Yeah, it's a top end relic.
It really is top end. And of course, St James is one of the great pilgrimage routes of medieval Europe, because the rest of his body, minus this hand that's in Reading allegedly, he's in Santiago de Compostela in northern Spain. And of course, that's still a major pilgrimage route today for the Catholic
part
Church.
of it, yes.
And it's an amazing route and a very arduous route, over the Pyrenees. So Reading was part of that pilgrimage. So Henry knew what he was doing when he was giving the hand to St James, because he's instantly setting Reading up, and the monks exploit that, because they start this almost like a PR machine. We have written record of the miracles that people had, had ailments, they couldn't walk, they might have the plague, they may have been blind. They come to Reading, they come and, touch or go near the relic and give an offering, and they're cured. And the monks churn out these things, a bit like press releases, going, look what happened in Reading, someone got cured of blindness, whatever. So they know what they're doing. So Reading had this infrastructure, so the relics were essential to that, and there were hundreds of relics, like St James. So bits of the true cross, bits of other saints, people's rib bones, you name it. At the Dissolution, there's a list. I think it's over, it may even be 150. There's a long list with the hands of James, but all these other bits and pieces, bits of holy water, and it was always jokes like the true cross. If you put together all the bits of the true cross around Europe, you would have had dozens. But again, it's actually devised from the start. So Reading was set up to be a pilgrimage location from the start, and that's in the architecture as well.
And it's just worth mentioning also, of course, which we see the shells, the sign of the pilgrim, and again you get that through on Santiago Camino, and again that's obviously embedded into Reading's coat of arms, the Abbey, and indeed students of the university will be familiar with the shell from Reading University as well, all connecting it back to the Abbey and the pilgrimage, the idea of pilgrimage here.
And I think the present day coat of arms that you're wearing has got sort of loops, isn't it? I think somewhere in it's too small, but again it's all part of that, and actually the coat of arms, the centre of it is actually echoes the other thing we'll probably talk about in a minute, is about the stresses the town had. Very early on, the abbot is very much in control, but as the town grows, because all these people are visiting, and therefore, you've got people visiting, so the inns and the shops and the markets all do well, the town gets rich independently as well. So again, you start to get tensions between that. Suddenly, the abbot's telling you what to do, but you're thinking, well, hang on, we're doing stuff here. So again, all of this sort of starts to shape Reading.
And also the merchant guild, the idea of the townsfolk having their own their own council and trying to sort of work against the abbot.
Yeah, I think very early on they were very much like, it was doffing your cap to and you did what you were told by the overlord. But we think there was a guild in Reading very early on, and probably even perhaps it may be on the abbot, that Reading was a borough, so it had this town status, we know how to mark it. So there may have been a guild and the guilds are a kind of group of the leading craftsmen and tradesmen. They come together to, look after their business interests, but also to run the town. And we think in Reading that maybe happened quite early, we don't have the full evidence, and it may be that when the abbey was founded there may have already been a guild. But when the abbot comes along, he's very much says, okay, I'll work with the guild, and the guild has a group which is, today's, it's what is now Reading Borough Council, but it starts all the way back then, hundreds of years ago. And obviously you're here as the mayor, well they always had someone who was their leader, and they used to choose that themselves. But actually when the abbey comes along, the abbot had the final choice. So what used to happen was that the burgesses, they were called, that they were the men who were on the council, the corporation, the guild, they would sort of say, they'd pick 3 men, and the abbot would get the final choice, say, I'll have him. Of course, he would pick the man he thought would probably say yes to him.
Yes, of course.
But increasingly, as the town was making more money, I think they got a bit annoyed being told what to do by this abbot, because they thought, well, hang on, we can run our own affairs. So there were lots of tensions. And sometimes then the king would get dragged into that, and there were frequent reports of the guild going to the king going, oh, it's not fair, the abbot's doing this, and the king thought, it's a bit like squabbling children. And sometimes he'd side with the abbot, and sometimes he'd side with the guild. And actually, in the centre of the coat of arms that you're wearing, you've got a crowned head and 3 other heads. They're now women in honour of Elizabeth I, who's behind us. But before Elizabeth's charter in the Tudor period, it was a king and 3 men, which is more representative of how it was in the guild period.
I see, that's what it thought. So there was also uncertainty about what we think these 4 characters were.
Yes, and they're definitely men earlier on, before they have a bit of a sex change in honour of Elizabeth. So again, it's actually, your chain of office links us right back to that medieval period. It's very appropriate we're having this conversation.
And again, that's something that's come through quite a number of these talks. And you said that the king getting involved. And obviously, we know that the courts periodically were held here in the chapter house. any evidence of him literally having sort of resolved issues or hearings about issues in Reading?
I think the evidence is sort of sketchy about the king totally getting involved. I think the fact that at certain points the king gives what they call he gives a charter direct to the guild, which gives the guild rights. And we know in 1500 there was a massive falling out between the abbot and what was then known as the warden, which became the mayor after the dissolution, definitely became there. And I think that in one of the charters, the king actually allows the mayor to have a mace.
Right.
And that's very much puts the abbot's nose out of joint, because it's a symbol of power.
Yes, of course.
Power. So I think there are some, we don't always have the complete records, but there are definite signs when the king is favouring the town, because he suddenly gives the town something that the abbot would not like, oh, here, have this symbol of power.
Yes.
Here, have a chain. Here, have a charter. And all of that. And apparently they were rowing for years about who got the rent from market stalls in Marketplace. You know, whether the guild should have the money or whether they have it. You know, you think, like, this must have known this, but the fact the king was willing to sort of sometimes side with the guild was perhaps a way of also keeping the abbot in his place as well.
Exactly, so you imagine playing, and interestingly also this happened right at the county level, where you have a sort of quite an old institution being high sheriff.
Yeah.
And he seemed to have sort of absorbed too much power, and so the creation of a Lord Lieutenant, and those two are sort of vying for control. And you've got the sort of large towns. You can see actually institutionally all these different players trying for one-upmanship and control of their area.
And I think all these people, they wanted to be the big cheese in the town, didn't they? You know, and they, you know, no one likes being told what to do, really, do they? So they're all trying to get the upper hand, really.
Yeah, that's a super picture. Again, it's such an extended period as well, which we know. And there were a couple of other sort of things I wanted to play with, which was, one was the type of order, the Cluniacs, and they were what we would describe as an open order. So you've got the Cistercians and sort of the closed orders up in the moors, or sort of hiding away and very much secluded. These orders, particularly the Cluniacs and the Benedictines, were open orders based in towns. What was the effect of that?
Yeah, so they're not like, as you say, like the Cistercians, who are closed orders where they very much keep themselves, it's quiet contemplation. They was other from society. Reading was an abbey that was very much integrated with the town, and hence why it's a very urban abbey. It's not one of those, you know, you get those lovely sort of ruined abbeys like Tintern or up in Yorkshire Fountains, which are very rural. This was an edge of urban abbey, and therefore it had hence the links economically. But also, as you were saying, they were very much part of society, so they were providing services to the town. So for the pilgrims and for the town, they had a guest house. In fact, the Hospitium, which is just behind us here, you can see at St. Ross's churchyard, that's the guest house for the pilgrims, but also it was an almshouse for aged and infirm people, and later it became part of Reading School, which we still have today. Yes. And the abbey was instrumental in all these things of giving hospitality to the guests, to the visitors to Reading, the pilgrims and visitors, to the old people of Reading. There was a leper hospital, which was providing, so leprosy was a very big disease in the medieval period, and we think that was out at what is, we call it Cemetery Junction because of the 19th century cemetery, but we know from finds that were found there in the Victorian period. In fact, here in museum displays we've got finds from there. There was a medieval, we think it was the medieval leper hospital owned by the Abbey, was on the borough boundary there, again, because they thought you could catch leprosy, so you tend to put it out in the fields, away from the population. So was that as well. So the Abbey was caring for people in lots of these different ways, and they were providing a school for free education within the borough. So all these things show that different outlook of being an open order, that they were out there as part of the community providing these services, you know, kind of what we call social services today.
Indeed.
And so all of that's going on. And then at the higher end, back to Henry founded Reading in the strategic location, knowing that kings would want to visit here. It's very handy, you know, it's a great jumping off point, and kings would go round the country to show their face and to insert their power. And we know that kings were always in Reading. Some kings were here very little, but some were stayed for months on end. And the abbot's lodgings were a palace. They were palatial. He was a lord of the realm, the abbot, but also I think Henry, we know the scale of Reading is pretty big, like some of the big, very big domestic buildings that were bigger than they needed to be. And we think that was almost like he was almost designing a bit of a conference centre, because they kind of knew that at certain points court would descend with thousands of people, and you needed that space to not just host the monastic community and the normal pilgrims, but suddenly you've got to house court with all the hangers on. You can imagine when the king moves, he's bringing hundreds and thousands of people his retinue with him. So again, we've got all these levels of hospitality happening here, from the king to the pauper at the gate. You know, so very much that's reflected in Reading.
You can just imagine the sort of townsfolk sort of looking on and seeing these sort of great processions arrive. There's an account of, I think, Henry VIII coming, and hundreds of carriages carrying all his sort of trade and his jewellery and clothes and sort of hunting kit. Unbelievable. So we've got a super picture then of all this activity generated by the Abbey, which must have been well received by the town. It's creating income, steady income as well. So I can imagine that a lot of the time there was a tremendous affinity and working relationship. We were going well together. It's not like having a barracks imposed by sort of drunken soldiers and so on. You've got monks quietly getting on and actually being quite helpful in terms of educating, in terms of providing some medical services. So one imagines that there was quite a sort of, they cherished it, they actually were pleased to have this large institution on their doorstep. And the other thing, of course, we had this series of, I think, sort of royal weddings happened here. I don't know how many of those, but you can imagine they'd been quite sort of a sense of festival.
Yeah, I think that's the thing, whether it's weddings and parliaments and great visits and fairs and diplomacy, the Heraclius, who was the Patriarch of Jerusalem, came here to plead for the Crusades. So you've got these great figures of European society, and as you say, weddings. Elizabeth Woodville is presented here as the Queen of England because they'd had a secret marriage, and so these great affairs of state happen here. But as you say, all of that brought opportunities to the town. And I think the tension probably comes later in the medieval period, when Reading is actually becomes more of a trading centre for wool and cloth, and it's making its money more from that trade, which is very late in the Abbey history. And I think that becomes almost economically more important. That's where the guild starts. It's actually around 1500 that it almost have the biggest fights, which is only 39 years before the Dissolution.
Yes.
So actually, I think up to then probably there were little these problems, but actually it looks like it's later when the problems come, because actually it's the Reading's making more money out of the wool trade, all those sheep up in the Berkshire Downs, Newbury's the same, all the Berkshire towns are making money out of the wool trade, and probably it's that point they're going, well, do you know what, perhaps the Abbey's a bit of not so great for us, it's actually this wool trade that's making our money, and being told what to do when we're making independent wealth. And fun enough, you see it in St Lawrence's Church, if you look at that tower, it's of that period. And it has the coat of arms of the Abbey on one side and the Guild on the other. I think that's an assertion. The fact that the Guild is getting their coat of arms is because they're paying for it. I think so. Suddenly, you can see the money intervening a bit.
That's really interesting, because you're leading into this final phase of the Abbey, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But actually, it starts to explain perhaps the way the town viewed the Dissolution. Shortly after. So I don't want to go into the detail of the mechanics of what happened in the Dissolution, because I think we'll explore that in an upcoming talk. But we know it happened around about sort of 1538, 1539. It all happened incredibly quickly. We know that. But essentially we can talk just briefly through what happened to the abbot.
Yeah, again, it does happen quickly, and obviously I know you're going to explore more, but the story about why Henry VIII wants that, and it's not straightforward, is it? There's a lot of things going on. And actually, Hugh Farrington, who's the last abbot, things have gone badly in Reading, because most of the whether it's a friaries like a Grey Friars in Reading was another monastic institution here that's dissolved, but the friars aren't, they're pensioned off. And it's here. Hugh sticks to his guns and says, no, this is not right. And actually they fall out. And he was friends with Henry. Like Henry VIII used to come here and hunt. I think what's amazing is this is the wealth that abbots like Hugh had. He had his own vineyard at Catesgrove. He had a hunting deer park at Whitley, which is why it's called Whitley Park, Whitley Wood. And Henry used to be friends and stay with him and hunt there, because Henry was a great, hunting enthusiast. And it falls apart very quickly because of what Henry needs. And so poor Hugh ends up being hung-drawn and quartered in front of his own abbey with two other monks. And that's very rare in the Dissolution. It was only Colchester and Glastonbury where that happened. So Reading is an exception to everywhere else. It kind of, there's destruction, but there's little death, amongst the community. So for Reading, it really went badly wrong. And it went,
well, personally, with Hugh, it's
very
one sense almost things I've read, he just didn't quite grasp what was happening so fast, and the determination of the reformers. This is going to happen. And if you get in the way of it, you're just going to get knocked over.
And I think early on,
most of them grasp the fact. Let's not try to impede this. It's going to happen. So we'll step back and take our pension.
I think Hugh got it wrong. I think early on he'd read the runes, because Thomas Cromwell, who was the right-hand man of Henry of getting this done, he actually gives Thomas, before the Dissolution, a role in Reading. I think it was as steward. So he gets that right, but somehow he reads the political runes wrongly. And it shows with Henry, well, this often happens, doesn't it? Look at Cromwell, he was on the right side. You can be, the closest you with Henry are often the ones who get burned, because they're sailing close to the wind, aren't they?
Exactly. It's the East End,
So I think it was a dramatic end in Reading, and you know, and everyone around saw that, and probably was then very, very reticent of doing anything wrong at that point.
But then you alluded to earlier, one of my questions was about the reaction of the town, how do they think about this? So I would imagine on a personal level, they're pretty shocked by what happened to him. But then we've got this growing power of the guilds. You can see almost they weren't too upset the fact that the Abbey had now been had its power taken away from it. Now the Laynor were ascendant, controlling their own town. They didn't have all this interference. One can imagine actually they weren't too displeased.
No, I think from the town's point of view, it's self-determination. Like, it's not democracy as we know it, because it's still only a small group of elites who are controlling. But it's the elite in Reading who've finally got the upper hand. And again, they've got an absentee landlord. The abbot's gone as lord. The king's now lord. He's not here. They can get on with it more. And I think also they realise that, well, the king's the one who's doing all this, so you want to be on the right side of the king, don't you? So I think, they follow the room. So however they felt personally, remember, they're still Catholics, so I'm sure they had a view on what was happening and what was happening with the Catholic Church and the fact that the Pope, but they would have kept that to themselves mostly, because you were at risk of your life if you dissented. And of course, it changes after that, because it keeps changing, doesn't it? Henry's children, you get the mix of moving from Catholic to Protestant, and it doesn't really settle down properly until you get Elizabeth, who's behind us here, and you get her reign stability, and it's definitely Protestant, and we know that she retains the abbot's lodgings as a palace, and she gives the town a charter, which is more, so again, you can see those periods of turbulence until Elizabeth comes along, and it probably just calms down domestically, and the guild probably settle in, and then Reading, I think, sort of drift into being more of a backwater, really. National events happen, but as a town, it kind of probably is quite kind of the stability in how it's ruled.
Yes. And so to briefly go as far as dissolution, we know then that actually, obviously, the Abbey was closed. The fabric, the structure of the buildings pretty much was stayed unmolested, undamaged for about another 7 or 8 years at least. Typically, the abbeys were quite quickly destroyed. Reading wasn't. It was only really when we had Edward VI and then, unfortunately, Seymour decides to completely strip it. But what they do leave behind, as you say, is actually effectively the abbot's house, which becomes like a royal palace. It could have remained so. That's interesting. Why it's, and that's why we're quite keen to have sat in front of Elizabeth, because she came quite a number of times using that. We think that same house.
Again, and that's why the Abbey Gate arrived, because it was the inner gate. The precinct was vast and had outer gates. The main gate was next to St Lawrence's Church, in from the marketplace. The inner gate controlled access from the public area, which was the Forbury, the open area where pilgrims and the public would come to and go to church, and the inner area where the monks lived, and where Abbot's House office block is today next to it. That's where this palatial Abbot's House was, and the gate became the access to this palace that was retained by the Tudors. And that's where, apparently it's one of Elizabeth's sort of favourite small residences. And she had her seat reserved for her in St Lawrence's Church because she came so regularly. So, and yes, it's really only the fact that then, 100 years after the dissolution, we have the English Civil War, and Reading is caught between the King at Oxford and Parliament in London, and we have Reading changing hands, and there's a siege of Reading in 1643, that the palace is damaged and never recovers.
Yes, because I think we're actually in the Civil War records, there's still a record of there being, the King's House.
Yes.
So it still survived then, and it was only really after Civil War.
It's then, it's not repaired and it's stripped apart. And again, as you say, there's these periods of, Edward and the Duke of Somerset stripped the site, and then again, I think with the Civil War, there's more damage done because of the siege of Reading and other things, and that's when, really by that point, the ruins that survive today is what was left. So it's a 100-year period of destruction physically, and and the Abbey sold off, and Reading kind of becomes a sort of quieter place really as a result.
So it's a civic centre, lost all this ecclesiastical. And so what we're left with, really, if we start to draw things to a close, is some of the fabrics still exist. We know, obviously, a number of the blocks were used in St Lawrence and St Mary's Church, in certain houses around the town. We've just been discussing, we know that the culverts, we know that some of the columns were recycled as arches. So physically, some of the stuff, and then we also see it in terms of some of the heraldry, some of the sort of the symbolism that's still in the town. There's a continuity there. But rather sadly, apart from our flints and our ruins, that's pretty much it in terms of the influence of the Abbey after really the 1600s, I guess.
Yeah, as I say, as we said before, that layout, like we've inherited their layout.
Yes.
So again, underneath it all, it doesn't seem that it's still influencing life. And I think quite interesting the fact that the town hall is here, because one of the things that Elizabeth does, she gives the guild the hospitium as the town hall. And that's why the town hall is here, because it's basically a Victorian extension of the medieval building. So that, this was the seat of power right up until the 1970s, before it moved to civic offices. And the fact the courts are still in the Forbury, that's a sign of the fact that justice is still within the Abbey area. So, because it passed over, the abbot ran the courts, and then they passed back to the king and the normal justice system we have today. And the fact the prison was here was also the centre, where So the reason why a lot of the infrastructure is as it is today is because of the Abbey. So you could say yes, a lot's gone, but actually it's indirectly influenced our life today. Even if we don't realise it, it's still got these tentacles that are reaching back forward in time to us today and influencing how Reading operates as a modern town today.
And that's super, to bring it to a sort of super conclusion there, exactly that, is that we don't realise, there's only when you sort of listen here and hear those connections that really, really brings it alive. So Matthew, thank you so much for that, really interesting, I've learnt a lot. We sort of scampered through about sort of 400 years of the Abbey's existence, but I think hopefully we've got a sense of how much it interrelated the town and actually how much it's left behind. So still now we're still talking about it, which is important, and hopefully we've explained a bit more about, in this case, how it related to the town and what it did for Reading. So thank you very much.
Thank you, it's been fascinating.
Pleasure. And just to conclude, thank you very much to our production staff. Lucy's still down watching with us, and Sean's around. And thank you also for, once again, Matthew, allowing us to use your museum as our studio.
Our pleasure. No, absolutely appropriate the 9th anniversary.
Good stuff. Thank you very much. Goodbye.